So, Kevin, let's talk about the top four questions that we get from clients who are just beginning to investigate an ESOP. And I think that the first question is most often, how do we find out if an ESOP is a good fit for us?
Mhm. Yeah, the whole notion of a good fit has a few aspects to it. Financial, tax, what does the seller want to do? But the way we look at it is that it's most important to determine whether or not it's suitable for the company, suitable for the seller, suitable for the non-selling shareholders, and of course for management. In other words, is it the right thing to do? Instead of diving into the numbers, what we prefer to do is what we call an ESOP suitability review. And so we gather all the necessary data and we map out the issues and we work with them and you know go through a diagnostic essentially of all the things that we know come up in ESOP transactions for each of those constituencies, companies, sellers, non-sellers, and try to figure out, are there any trade-offs? Are there any compromises, objections? Sometimes these objectives can't be all done at once, and sometimes they're sequential. Then again, there are these things we look out for that are called ESOP stoppers, and we consider them situations where you just shouldn't do an ESOP, and we'll tell the client that. And based upon the analysis and the input, we'll boil it all down, and we'll try to come up with a couple of possible alternatives of which way they could go with some type of ESOP, some kind of transaction. Perhaps more importantly, just don't do an ESOP because it's not the right solution, and send them on their way and find something that's more appropriate for them.
So, once we've decided that an ESOP is suitable for us and our company, what do we do next?
Well, okay, so you decide it's suitable, and most typically from the seller side, but honestly, you're talking about selling your company or part of your company to a third party. An ESOP truly is a third party. The law says you have to treat an ESOP the same as any third party that's able to buy for cash. And the trustee is the party that represents the ESOP on behalf of the beneficiary. So the trustee has to determine things like what can the ESOP pay, or are there issues regarding due diligence that underlie the company that they're going to have to explore, really dig into. So we think the best thing to do is first decide on who should be the trustee. Select the trustee or hire a professional trustee and get a grip on what the potential buyer thinks about the company before you go any step further.
Right. So, you mentioned pricing. What about pricing? How much will an ESOP pay for a company?
Yeah, from the seller side, that's got to be the burning question. How much can I get for a company, and can an ESOP pay me enough? Well, you can do all kinds of studies from the seller side and the company side and whatnot, but following what I just said about the second question, the ESOP trustee has to get their arms around what we call a range of values, because it's impossible to say, this is the value for the company, this is what we will pay. And then both sides are going to have their perspectives, buyer and seller. So we'd like the trustee to go out and get their qualified independent appraiser, which they have to have by law, and have that appraiser produce that preliminary range, not a complete appraisal report. That allows the buyer and the seller to sit down and say, yeah, we're kind of in the ballpark, we're in this framework, and this is how we're looking at value. And it's true, the seller may very well need to get his own appraiser, or as part of what we're going to talk about in a little bit, they may have to come up with what they think is the value. But ultimately, under the law, when the dust settles and you've completed a transaction, the ESOP trustee can only pay adequate consideration. So you're negotiating with a third-party buyer, and they're going to come up with a number, and you're going to agree or disagree. And it's not a hard and fast this number. All kinds of factors go into it, like the size of the transaction and whatnot. So focus on that preliminary range of values, get the discussion started, make sure you're doing a prudent job, and then let everybody say, okay, yeah, we're going to go forward based upon this price or price range, and start structuring the transaction in earnest.
Right. So, just a brief recap, we've decided that the ESOP is suitable for us. We've brought a fiduciary on board who's going to determine what a reasonable range of value is for the company to structure a transaction. What do we do next? What are the nuts and bolts of putting an ESOP transaction together?
Yeah, this is where the fun starts for all the professionals. Uh, You know, it's at this point that what we think you have to do is determine feasibility, get into what a lot of people call a feasibility study. And you'll talk to a lot of advisors who will say, let's do the feasibility first. That's the first step, and we have to figure out whether the company can do it. We don't approach it as we've just discussed. We don't approach it exactly that same way, except if you're talking about a really large transaction with multiple levels of debt, yeah, maybe you do start there because, if your heart is set on a complete leverage buyout and you have all kinds of business issues, sure, dive down into those numbers. So constructing the transaction, getting it going, pinning down the design requires you to dive into essentials of cash flow projections, earnings, or EBITDA, which is, what primarily drives the valuation. You have to look at the tax advantages of different structures, C versus S, and really see if it's going to meet your needs and whether you can finance it. And you got to bear in mind that there are a lot of different types of ESOP transactions, ways you can structure it, the ways you can finance it. And that's what you hammer out in that feasibility analysis to figure out what's prudent. Maybe a small transaction, you don't need a full-blown study, but in a large transaction, you're definitely going to dive in. You're going to do that kind of work to make sure that all of the features you put in the transaction are going to work and that it's going to be sustainable for the company and kind of seller get what they need. And, generally speaking, always take care of the golden goose, which is the company. It really has to be feasible and the company has to be viable.
Great.
Wendy, I think this would be a good point. I think since we're talking about tax impacts and types of transactions, this is probably a good point to tell people about our ESOP calculator. What we've tried to do is boil down these tax trade-offs for the company and for the seller and say, hey, C versus S, big versus small. What's the comparison of the primary structures? And we're putting that ESOP calculator up on our website, and we can send you a link to it. And I think it's worthwhile to just spend a few minutes and plug in some basic assumptions, ballparks perhaps, and start getting a feel for really quantitatively what are these tax incentives that everybody is telling you about and that you're reading about.
Great. Those are the answers to the top 4 questions that we get all the time. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, Wendy.